Ruby Ramsey did not cry easily. She had buried her mother at 16, survived 3 Kansas winters on nothing but cornmeal and stubbornness, and talked her way out of a cattle baron's jail cell using nothing more than her sharp tongue and a hairpin. But standing in the doorway of the Underwood kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon in late October of 1882, with flour dusted across her dark green skirt and tears burning hot down her cheeks, she finally understood that she had lost something she had never even known she was fighting to keep. The letter was in her hand. She had found it on the kitchen table, weighted down by the sugar jar as if someone had placed it there deliberately, carefully, knowing exactly when she would find it. The handwriting belonged to a child. 2 children, in fact. She recognized Nora's careful, looping script and the wild, slanted scratches that belonged unmistakably to Thomas. It read in full, "Dear Miss Ramsey, we are sorry we lied to you, but you cannot leave. Papa needs you, even if he is too stubborn to say so. We hid your train ticket. We told Mrs. Calloway you already left so nobody will come looking. You are stuck here now. Please do not be angry. We love you, Thomas and Nora Underwood." She read it twice. Then a third time. The sugar jar caught the afternoon light and threw it in small bright ribbons across the worn pine floor. Behind her, the kitchen door opened. "Ruby." Arthur Underwood's voice was low and careful, the same voice she had heard him use when approaching a spooked horse. She did not turn around. "Did you know?" she asked. The silence that followed was answer enough. She had arrived in Halo Creek, Texas in the 2nd week of September, and she had been absolutely certain she would be gone before the first leaves turned. It had started, as most things in her life did, with a desperate advertisement and a willingness to do what other women would not. The notice had appeared in the back pages of the Denver Gazette, tucked between a listing for a patent medicine and a plea from a man seeking information about his missing brother. It read with the kind of blunt economy that Ruby had come to recognize as a marker of genuine desperation. "Wanted, capable woman for household management. 2 children ages 7 and 9. Temporary position 2 weeks, possibly extending to 1 month. Fair wages. Room and board provided. Apply in writing to Arthur Underwood, Halo Creek, Texas." No nonsense. Ruby had stared at that advertisement for 4 full minutes. She had been in Denver for 3 weeks, having fled a disastrous situation as a seamstress in Colorado Springs after the shop owner had tried, for the 3rd and final time, to underpay her and then lie to her face about it. She had exactly $6.42 to her name, a carpet bag containing 2 dresses, 1 good pair of boots, and a copy of a botanical encyclopedia she carried purely for the pleasure of it. 2 weeks, maybe a month, fair wages. She could do that standing on her head. She wrote the letter that evening. Arthur Underwood's reply came 8 days later, which was faster than she expected given the distance. It was brief, practical, and told her almost nothing about who he was as a person. He would meet her at the Halo Creek Depot on September 14th. He would pay for her train fare in advance, which he enclosed as a voucher. He expected someone reliable. She arrived at the Halo Creek Depot at 2:30 on a Friday afternoon, the September heat pressing down on the brown Texas landscape like a hot iron on linen. The town was smaller than Denver but larger than she had feared. There was a main street with a general store, a post office, a doctor's office, a barber, 2 saloons that faced each other across the dusty road like old rivals, a church with a white steeple that needed painting, and a feed store with a hand-lettered sign that had been partially weathered away so that it now read simply EED in faded red letters. She stood on the depot platform with her carpet bag and looked around. He was leaning against the far post of the platform awning, arms crossed, hat pulled low against the sun. He was taller than she expected. Broader, too, with the kind of build that came from actual labor rather than vanity. He was wearing a plain work shirt, dark trousers, and boots that had been recently cleaned but showed honest wear. His hat was brown and slightly battered. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something difficult, and dark eyes that were watching her with an expression she could not immediately decode. He pushed off the post and walked toward her. "Miss Ramsey," he said, not a question. He had apparently recognized her from whatever mental picture a letter from a desperate woman could construct. "Mr. Underwood," she said. He reached for her carpet bag and she did not resist, which surprised her. She was not usually the type to let a man carry her things, but something about the gesture felt so entirely without performance that it disarmed her before she had even had time to be on guard. "Train was on time," he said, as they walked toward a buckboard waiting at the edge of the depot yard. "Usually is," she replied. That was essentially the entire conversation for the first 6 miles. Ruby was not bothered by silence. She had lived alone long enough to know that silence could be companionable or hostile, and this one was neither. It was simply the silence of two strangers measuring each other without being obvious about it. She watched the landscape, which was wide and flat with the kind of enormous sky that she had not expected to find beautiful but did. The grass was dry and golden and endless, interrupted by stands of mesquite and the occasional wind-bent cottonwood near a creek bed. The Underwood property announced itself with a gate made from 2 upright cedar posts and a crossbar from which a wooden sign hung. The sign said Underwood in burned letters. The driveway, such as it was, ran a 1/4 mile through a pasture where a dozen or so cattle stood in the late afternoon shade of a scattered grove. The house came into view around a gentle curve, and Ruby absorbed it in a single careful glance. It was a solid house, not grand but built with intention. 2 stories of white-painted clapboard with a wide front porch, green shutters on the ground floor windows, a stone chimney at either end. A barn in good repair stood to the east, and a kitchen garden, somewhat neglected now in the dry heat, ran along the south side of the house. There was a windmill turning slowly in the afternoon breeze, and a water trough that the horses clearly knew well because Arthur's team walked toward it without being directed. "It is a good house," Ruby said before she had decided to speak. Arthur glanced at her sideways. "My wife thought so," he said. The past tense landed quietly between them. "When did she pass?" Ruby asked, because she had learned that people who wanted to avoid a question found evasion easier than those who wanted to answer it. 3 years ago," Arthur said. "Fever, quick at the end." "I am sorry," Ruby said. She meant it simply, without elaboration, and he seemed to receive it that way. The 2 children appeared before the buckboard had fully stopped. They erupted from the front door and clattered down the porch steps with the uncontained energy of people who had been waiting far too long for something to happen. Thomas was 9 and looked it in every way. He was long-legged and slightly coltish, with dark hair that stood up in 3 separate directions, despite what appeared to have been a recent attempt to flatten it with water. He had his father's jawline and his own particular brand of incandescent curiosity that showed itself immediately when he skidded to a stop and stared up at Ruby with frank, assessing eyes. Nora was 7. She was smaller than her brother, with her mother's coloring apparently, because her hair was lighter and her eyes were a soft gray-green that Ruby would later learn changed shade depending on what she was wearing. She hung back 1 step behind Thomas, but her gaze was every bit as direct. "You are Miss Ramsey," Thomas announced. "I am," Ruby confirmed. "You are taller than I thought a nanny would be," he said. "I am not a nanny," Ruby said pleasantly. "I am a housekeeper. The distinction is important." Thomas appeared to find this interesting rather than off-putting. "What is the difference? A nanny minds children. A housekeeper minds the house. I will do some of both, but let us be clear about what my actual job is." Nora made a small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Arthur had come around the buckboard and was watching this exchange with his arms folded, and an expression that Ruby could not quite read. It was not approval exactly, but it was something adjacent to it. "Thomas, Nora, take Miss Ramsey's bag inside and show her to the guest room," Arthur said. "And try not to overwhelm her in the first 5 minutes. "We are not overwhelming," Thomas protested, already reaching for the carpet bag. "You are a little overwhelming," Nora told him, with the serene authority of a younger sibling who had learned to be devastating with precision. Ruby followed them up the porch steps and into the house, and that was how it began. The guest room was on the ground floor, just off the main hall, and was a spare, clean room with a good bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the kitchen garden. There was a braided rug on the floor and a small mirror above the washstand and a hook on the back of the door. It was perfectly adequate and had the feeling of a room that was not often used. Ruby unpacked her 2 dresses, hung one on the hook, folded the other in the single drawer of the washstand, placed her botanical encyclopedia on the windowsill, set her boots beside the bed, and considered herself settled. The house was not in disaster, but it was in the particular kind of disorganized decline that happened when someone competent had been absent for too long. The kitchen was functional but not orderly. The parlor was tidy in the way that things are tidy when nobody actually uses them. The children's rooms upstairs were chaotic in ways that spoke of freedom rather than neglect, books and toy soldiers, and a collection of interesting rocks that Thomas had apparently been amassing for some time. The root cellar was adequately stocked. The laundry situation needed attention. There was a woman named Mrs. Patton from town who came out Mondays and Thursdays to help, a stout, cheerful widow of about 50, who arrived the following Monday with her sleeves already rolled, and told Ruby everything she needed to know about the household in approximately 45 minutes of continuous narration while they hung sheets. Arthur Underwood had run his cattle operation essentially alone since his wife Alina had died, with help from 2 ranch hands named Pete and Domingo who slept in the bunkhouse and handled the livestock. He was, according to Mrs. Patton, the most stubborn man in 3 counties, honest to a fault, generous when he did not think you were watching him be generous, and had not spoken to any woman socially in any meaningful way since Alina's passing except out of pure necessity. "He is not cold," Mrs. Patton said, pinning a sheet with authority. "He is just protected. There is a difference." Ruby absorbed this information the same way she absorbed most useful information, quietly and without comment. The first week passed, with the orderly satisfaction of a job being done well. Ruby reorganized the kitchen from the ground up, which Arthur noticed but said nothing about until he opened a cabinet on the 3rd day and found his coffee things exactly where he would have put them himself if he had thought about it deliberately. He stood there for a moment, looking at the arranged tins and the clean shelf, and then he said, "How did you know where I would want them?" Ruby did not look up from the bread she was shaping. "I watched where your hand went the first morning when you were half awake and not thinking about it," she said. "People always reach for things where they feel they should be before habit teaches them otherwise, so I put them there." Another silence. "Then that is observant. That is efficient," she corrected, but she was almost smiling. The children were, as she had assessed immediately, a project in themselves. Thomas was deeply intelligent and used it the way some people use a sharp knife, carelessly and occasionally dangerously. He wanted to know the reason for everything, questioned instructions on principle, rather than out of genuine defiance, and had a habit of disappearing into the barn for hours to conduct experiments that he was evasive about describing. Nora was quieter but in no way passive. She was a watcher and a keeper of information, and she had a gift for appearing in rooms exactly when something interesting was happening. They tested Ruby the way children test all newcomers, with small defiances and strategic appeals to emotion and an occasional bout of weaponized cuteness. Ruby was unmoved by all of it, but not unkind. She established a clear daily structure within the first 3 days, and the children, having apparently been longing for exactly that even while resisting it, fell into it with a relief that they were too young to articulate. By the end of the first week, Thomas was teaching her his rock collection's full taxonomy, and Nora had started leaving small things on Ruby's pillow: a wildflower, a smooth piece of quartz, once a drawing of a horse that was aspirational rather than accurate. The second week was when things began to quietly shift in ways Ruby did not notice until she was already in the middle of them. She had settled into a routine with Arthur that involved almost no direct conversation, but had developed its own wordless vocabulary. He came in for breakfast at 6:30, always, after the morning feeding was done, and he always hung his hat on the same peg by the kitchen door. He drank his coffee black and he read whatever mail had come the previous day while he ate, and he never left the table without taking his plate to the sink. He said good morning every day and good evening every day with a consistency that Ruby came to find oddly steadying. But it was on a Thursday of that second week that the routine broke. She had been in the kitchen garden at dusk, fighting a losing battle with a patch of bindweed that had colonized the tomato plants, when she heard raised voices from the direction of the barn. One of them was Arthur's, stripped of its usual measured quality and raw in a way that stopped her hands. The other was a man she did not recognize. She did not go to look, that was not her place, but she stood still in the garden and the voices carried in the evening quiet. "You owe me for what your family did, Underwood," the unfamiliar voice was saying. It was a voice with weight behind it, aged and deliberate. "And what your family owes does not just disappear because you were too young to be part of it." "Whatever you think my father did," Arthur said, and his voice was controlled but barely, "has nothing to do with me or this land." "Land has a long memory," the other man said. "And so do I." Then silence, and the sound of a horse leaving at a fast walk. Ruby continued pulling bindweed. But she thought about it all through dinner and into the long dark of the night. She told herself it was none of her business. She believed this for approximately 4 more days. The man's name, she learned through the entirely respectable avenue of listening carefully when Mrs. Patton was talking, was Randall Cutter. He was the surviving son of a rancher who had lost his property to debt and drought 2 decades earlier, a debt that had allegedly been engineered by Arthur's father, Josiah Underwood, who had been the kind of man who built wealth on other people's misfortune and called it business. Josiah had been dead for 4 years. Randall Cutter had returned to Halo Creek the previous spring and had been making trouble in small, deliberate ways ever since. "Is it a real debt?" Ruby asked Mrs. Patton, who paused her churning and looked at Ruby with a measuring expression. "Josiah Underwood was not a good man," Mrs. Patton said, carefully. "Arthur is nothing like his father, but the sins of fathers have a way of landing on sons whether they deserve it or not." Ruby thought about dark pasts and inherited guilt, and the way some people spent their whole lives paying for things they had not chosen. She thought about it while she watched Arthur at dinner that evening, the way he helped Nora cut her meat without being asked, the way he listened to Thomas's long and wandering account of something he had read in an almanac with genuine patient attention, the way he refilled Ruby's water glass without fanfare when he noticed it was empty. There was nothing hidden about him, she realized. That was unusual. Most people who had been through loss cultivated a kind of opacity, a deliberate obscuring of the interior. Arthur Underwood's grief was not hidden. It was simply present, like a piece of furniture that had been there long enough to become part of the room. She found it more unsettling than hidden things. Hidden things she knew how to navigate. This kind of open, quiet sadness made her feel something she was not prepared to feel. She told herself that her 2 weeks were nearly up and she would be gone soon. She started sleeping less well. It was at the end of the second week, on a Sunday, that the children made their first deliberate move. Ruby had been planning to speak to Arthur about her departure. She had composed the practical conversation in her head several times. She had her wages, minus what she had spent on supplies for the house, and she had the train voucher for her return to Denver. She would thank him sincerely. She would say goodbye to the children, which she had already decided she would keep brief because prolonged goodbyes were an indulgence she could not afford. She came down to breakfast on Sunday morning to find Nora at the kitchen table, crying with the kind of dignified, silent concentration that was somehow more devastating than ordinary tears. Ruby stopped. "What is wrong?" Nora looked up. Her gray-green eyes were wet and very serious. "I dreamed about Mama," she said. "I dream about her sometimes, and when I wake up she is gone all over again." Ruby sat down across from her. She did not say everything will be all right, because she had never found that phrase useful when she was grieving, and she saw no reason to assume children felt differently. She said, "That sounds very hard." Nora nodded. "It is especially hard," she said, with the formal precision of someone choosing their words carefully, "when I think about losing someone else." Ruby looked at her. "Nora." The child looked back at her with gray-green eyes that were entirely too knowing for 7 years old. "Are you going to leave soon?" Ruby opened her mouth and closed it again. "I was hired for 2 weeks," she said finally. "I know," Nora said. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a small, tidy gesture. "I just wanted to tell you about the dream." Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway a moment later in his nightshirt, hair aggressively vertical, and announced that he had a stomachache. He did not appear to have a stomachache. He appeared to be a 9-year-old who had recently been briefed on a strategy. Ruby looked between them. "Are the two of you collaborating against me?" she asked. Thomas's expression went carefully neutral in a way that confirmed everything. "Sit down," Ruby said. "I will make eggs." She made eggs. She did not bring up leaving again. She told herself she would have the conversation with Arthur later that day. She did not have it that day, or the next day, or the day after that. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment. She told herself there were still things the house needed that she could do before she left. She reorganized the root cellar, which needed it. She repaired a tear in Thomas's good Sunday trousers. She planted the kitchen garden's second bed with the late-season turnip seeds she found in the barn. What she was actually doing, she would not examine too closely. It was Arthur who brought it up, on a Wednesday evening when the children were in bed and Ruby was sitting at the kitchen table with the household accounts, which she had been quietly keeping in order for the past week without being asked. He came in from a late check on the livestock and stopped when he saw her there with the ledger. He poured himself a cup of water from the pitcher and leaned against the counter. "Your 2 weeks ended Sunday," he said. "I know," Ruby said. She kept her eyes on the ledger. "I have not had a chance to discuss the extension with you properly," he said. "I apologize for that. If you want to go, the voucher is still valid. If you want to stay, I will pay you accordingly." Ruby looked up from the ledger. He was watching her with those dark, careful eyes, and there was something in his expression that she could not identify cleanly. It was not hope exactly. It was something more guarded than hope, something that had been disappointed before and had learned to expect disappointment. "The kitchen garden will not be established properly for another month," she said. "That is true," he said. "And Thomas needs someone to make certain he actually does his reading lessons instead of just telling you he has done them." A slight shift in Arthur's expression. "Also true." "And Nora," Ruby said, and then stopped, because what she had been about to say was something private that Nora had shared with her and that Ruby did not think was hers to repeat. "Nora," Arthur said quietly, and the way he said his daughter's name had all the complicated weight of a father who loved deeply and was not always sure he was enough. "I will stay through the month," Ruby said, "if that works for you." "It does," Arthur said. They looked at each other across the kitchen for a moment that was about 4 seconds long but felt longer. "Thank you," he said. She looked back at the ledger. "The accounts are in reasonable shape," she said. "But you are overpaying for grain at the Callaway feed store. The Mercer operation in Alderton sells it cheaper and their quality is better." Arthur looked at her. Then he actually laughed, a short, genuine sound that she had not heard from him before, and that did something entirely unauthorized to her chest. "Noted," he said. "Good night, Miss Ramsey." "Good night, Mr. Underwood," she said. October arrived with cooler mornings and a smell in the air that Ruby had loved since childhood. That particular quality of autumn air that was dry and clear, and carried with it the feeling of things being completed, harvested, put by for winter. She had always felt more herself in autumn than in any other season, and she moved through the Underwood house, and its rhythms with an ease that she noticed was becoming something she would have to think about carefully. She was thinking about it, in fact. She was thinking about it a great deal more than she was comfortable with. The problem, or the thing she kept insisting to herself was a problem, was that Arthur Underwood was not at all what she had expected when she had answered an advertisement for a temporary position with a widowed rancher. She had expected competent grief and polite distance, and a straightforward employer-employee arrangement that would leave her feelings entirely uninvolved. She had expected someone raw and needy in ways that would exhaust her, or alternatively someone closed off in ways that would make the work sterile and simple. Arthur was neither of these things. He was someone who had clearly done the hard, private work of surviving loss without losing himself entirely, and he was present in his own life in a way that she found increasingly difficult to look away from. She watched him with his children and saw something that made her throat tight. He was not a soft man, and he made no pretense of being one, but he was attentive in ways that cost him, she could tell. He noticed. He remembered. Thomas mentioned once in passing at breakfast that he had read about a particular type of hawk in his almanac, and a week later Arthur came home from town with a small illustrated guide to birds of the Texas plains that he set beside Thomas's plate at dinner without comment. Nora had a habit of humming to herself when she was doing something she enjoyed, and Arthur would sometimes stop what he was doing when he heard it and simply listen for a moment, with an expression that was almost unbearable to see on a person that guarded. Ruby had not been in love before. She had been close to it twice, in the way that you are close to places you pass but do not stop in. She knew what she was in danger of now, and she knew also that she was in no position for it to matter. She was a temporary housekeeper with $6 in savings and a life that consisted entirely of moving from one place to the next. He was a widowed rancher with 2 children and a ranch, and roots in this land that went down so deep they had outlasted grief and bad fathers, and a man named Randall Cutter, who was making increasingly obvious trouble. She made herself think about Randall Cutter, because thinking about him was safer than thinking about the other thing. Cutter had been by the property again twice, that she knew of. Both times had resulted in those brief, tightly controlled confrontations in the yard that she witnessed from a distance. She had the sense that Cutter was circling, testing, looking for leverage. He had not been physically threatening yet, but the threat of it was in the air like a smell before rain. She brought it up with Mrs. Patton one Monday. "What does Cutter actually want?" Ruby asked. Mrs. Patton's cheerful face went briefly complicated. "He says he wants the eastern parcel. The 40 acres that Josiah Underwood acquired from Cutter's father in '80. He says the acquisition was fraudulent." "Was it?" "Probably," Mrs. Patton said, without hesitation. "Josiah Underwood was the kind of man who made things legal that were not right, but Arthur has had that land his whole life. It is part of his operation. If Cutter takes it to the county seat and finds a lawyer hungry enough, it could be very difficult." Ruby thought about this. She thought about it later that evening when she was putting away the dishes and Arthur came in and sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and the tired, contained expression of someone who had been carrying something heavy all day. She made a decision. She set the last cup on its shelf and turned around. "Tell me about the Cutter situation," she said. Arthur looked at her with an expression that cycled through several things quickly: surprise, wariness, then something that was almost relief. "It is not your concern," he said, but without conviction. "I am living in this house," Ruby said. "Your children are in this house. Whatever threatens the stability of this situation is my concern for as long as I am here." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he told her. Josiah Underwood had been a land speculator as much as a cattleman. In 1880, during a severe drought that had broken 3 small ranching operations in the county, he had bought up distressed properties at a fraction of their value, using methods that were just barely on the legal side of predatory. The Cutter property had been one of them. The elder Cutter had been drunk and desperate, and had signed papers he may not have understood fully, and the 40 acres had transferred to Josiah Underwood for a sum that any honest person would call inadequate. Arthur had inherited the land along with everything else when Josiah died. He had also inherited the knowledge of how it had been acquired, which he had learned only after his father's death, going through papers. He had tried to locate Randall Cutter after that discovery to discuss some form of restitution, but Cutter had already heard what Arthur was, a man inheriting a fortune built on other people's ruin, and he had arrived back in Halo Creek not to negotiate but to take what he felt was owed with interest, a great deal of interest, more than any honest accounting would justify. "I understand why he is angry," Arthur said. "I do. What my father did was wrong. But Cutter is not looking for justice. He is looking for blood, and he is going to hurt people in the process of getting it." Ruby was quiet for a moment. "What if you gave him the 40 acres?" she asked. Arthur looked at her. "He wants the ranch house. He wants everything. He is using the 40 acres as the first pressure point." "Then you give him the 40 acres and you make it public," Ruby said, loudly and officially. "You go to the land office and you sign over the eastern parcel, and you tell anyone who asks that you are doing it because it was wrongly acquired and you believe in making things right. You take the moral ground away from him. If he still comes after you after that, he looks like the unreasonable one to everyone in this county, including any lawyer or judge." The silence in the kitchen was very complete. Arthur was staring at her. "I have been thinking about this wrong," he said slowly. "I have been thinking about it as a threat to defend against." "It is a debt to pay," Ruby said. "Those are different problems." He looked at her for a long time. The lamp on the table threw warm light across the kitchen, and there was the sound of wind picking up outside, rattling the shutters slightly. "Where did you come from?" he said. It was not entirely a question. Ruby looked down at the dish towel in her hands. "Kansas, originally," she said, "and after that various places." "That is not what I mean." She looked up. His expression was open in a way she had not seen from him before. Not guarded, not protected, just open. It was the most dangerous thing she had seen in a long time. She looked away first. "I will check on the children," she said, and left the kitchen. She lay awake a long time that night. Arthur went to the land office on Friday. He signed over the eastern 40 acres to Randall Cutter on the condition that the transfer was publicly recorded and that the reason for it, voluntary restitution for an unjust original acquisition, was noted in the official record. He came home that evening with the signed paperwork, and he set it on the kitchen table. Ruby did not make a fuss. She looked at the papers, nodded, and said, "How did Cutter take it?" "Confused," Arthur said. "He expected a fight. He did not know what to do with someone who agreed with him." "People who are looking for a fight rarely do," Ruby said. She thought about the hidden motives in situations like these. The way Cutter had probably built his grievance into something so large and consuming that having it partially addressed left him without a clear shape to his anger. "He made noise about the rest of it," Arthur said, "but he did not have a specific accusation. Without the legitimate grievance to anchor him, he is just a man making threats." "He may make trouble anyway," Ruby said. "He may," Arthur agreed, "but it is different trouble. Cutter did make trouble. But it was smaller trouble than it might have been, and it came not in the form of legal attacks but in the form of deliberate petty harassment. A fence line cut one morning, a water source on the boundary mudded. Arthur dealt with it with patient, methodical repair and a single visit to the county sheriff to put the pattern on official record. The sheriff, who knew Randall Cutter and had known Josiah Underwood, and seemed relieved to be dealing with a version of this old conflict that was finally behaving itself, filed the complaint without fanfare and spoke to Cutter directly. The harassment stopped. It was not resolved so much as it was contained, and the distinction was important. Randall Cutter was still somewhere out there, carrying his grievance like a stone in his chest that had become so familiar he did not know who he was without it. But he was no longer circling the Underwood property. The children noticed the change in the atmosphere of the household, even if they could not name what had caused it. Thomas became slightly less inclined to test everyone's boundaries, which Ruby suspected was because some of his anxiety had been expressing itself as defiance. Nora became more openly affectionate, which was saying something, because she had been affectionate from nearly the beginning, and something in Arthur Underwood's posture changed. It was subtle, the kind of change that you could only see if you had been watching someone closely for several weeks and had developed the habit of reading the precise angle of their shoulders. He was not lighter exactly, but he was more present, as though he had set something down. On a Saturday in mid-October, he asked if she would like to ride out with him to look at the north pasture. Ruby had not been on a horse in 2 years, which she told him, and he nodded and selected the most patient animal in his string, a bay mare of impeccable temperament named Clara, and helped Ruby check the cinch without making it seem like he was correcting her. They rode north through the dry grass in the cool morning air, and the conversation came more easily than it ever had indoors, as though the open space made room for it. She told him about Kansas, about her mother dying when she was 16 and her father who had gone west the year before that and been swallowed by the country. She told him about the years in between, moving through several states and territories, finding work with her hands and her head, never quite staying anywhere long enough to stop moving. She told him about the seamstress job in Colorado Springs and the shop owner who had cheated her, and the particular brand of cold fury with which she had departed. He listened. He did not offer solutions or reassurances. He just listened in that complete, attentive way that was one of the most underrated things a person could do for another person. He told her about Alina. She had been from a family in East Texas, educated and musical and entirely unsuited to the physical demands of ranch life. But she had loved the land and refused to leave it, and she had been, by his account, equal parts maddening and essential. He spoke about her with the particular tenderness of someone who has done enough grieving to reach the place where love and loss sit side by side without canceling each other out. Thomas has her memory, he said. Incandescent way of grabbing at information and never letting go. And Nora has something else, Ruby said. She has Alina's stillness, Arthur said. That quality of seeing everything and choosing very carefully what to do with it. They were riding along the creek by then, the cottonwoods above them dropping occasional yellow leaves into the water. Ruby's horse was walking beside his close enough that their stirrups occasionally nearly touched. "You are good at this," Ruby said. He glanced at her. "At what?" "Being a father," she said. "It would be very easy to disappear into the work and let the grief provide cover. You have not done that." He was quiet for a moment. "I have wanted to," he said honestly. "Some mornings I have wanted to very much." "The fact that you wanted to and did not," Ruby said, "is the whole thing." He looked at her and she made herself hold the look this time instead of looking away. The cottonwood leaves fell. There were things happening in the air between them that she had been naming as other things for weeks. Respect, professional regard, natural human warmth, the shared concern for 2 children who needed care. All of these were true, and none of them covered the full situation. She had a forbidden thought on the ride back, which was that if she stayed through winter there would be the spring after that, and after that summer, and at what point did a temporary position become something else entirely? She shut the thought down. She was a housekeeper. She had been hired for 2 weeks and had extended to a month and was already past that marker. She needed to have a clear, practical conversation about what the arrangement was and was not. She had this conversation with herself all the way back to the barn, and through the unsaddling, and right up until the moment she walked into the kitchen and found Thomas at the table with a book he was definitely not reading, and Nora perched on the counter with the expression of someone who has been waiting. "Papa was happy today," Nora observed, with the devastating precision that Ruby should have been accustomed to by now. "He was whistling in the barn this morning." "People often whistle," Ruby said, hanging up her hat. "Papa does not often whistle," Thomas said, without looking up from his unread book. Ruby looked at both of them. "What exactly are you two suggesting?" she asked. They exchanged a glance. It was a fully articulated conversation conducted in approximately 1 second. "Nothing," Nora said, in a tone that meant everything. Ruby made dinner. She did not address the subject further, but she lay awake again that night for a very long time, and this time she was not thinking about Randall Cutter. She was thinking about Arthur Underwood's laugh. She was thinking about the way he had looked at her on the creek bank, and the way she had held the look, and what it was that had been exchanged in that particular silence. She was thinking about Thomas's rock collection and Nora's drawings on her pillow and Mrs. Patton's cheerful Monday morning arrivals, and the way the kitchen smelled when she had bread baking, and how all of it had stopped feeling like a job somewhere in the third week, and had started feeling like something she did not have a safe word for. She was in serious trouble. She decided, very firmly, to find the train voucher in the morning, and confirm that it was still valid and have the clear, practical conversation. The train voucher was not where she had left it. She had kept it in the inner pocket of her carpet bag, tucked behind the lining seam where she kept her important documents. She turned the bag out entirely on the bed. She searched her room. She searched it again. It was gone. She stood in the middle of her room with the empty carpet bag in her hands and felt a cold, suspicious clarity begin to form. She walked to the kitchen. The sugar jar was on the table. Under the sugar jar was the letter. She read it. She read it twice and then a third time. The flour was already on her skirt from the morning baking. The tears came before she made the decision to allow them, which was unusual for her and alarming. Behind her, the kitchen door opened. Ruby. She did not turn around. "Did you know?" she asked. "I did not know they took the voucher," Arthur said. His voice was careful. "I swear to you that I did not. But I would be lying if I told you I do not understand why they did it." She turned around then. He was standing in the kitchen doorway, hat in his hand, and his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. Not protected, not managed. The interior of him was right there on his face, and what she saw there made her chest hurt. "They hid my ticket," she said. "They told your housekeeper from town that I had already left." "I know," he said. "I found out 20 minutes ago. I made Thomas tell me." "Where is Thomas?" "He is outside, sitting on the porch step, waiting to see whether he has destroyed something or made something better," Arthur said. "He is 9 years old and he genuinely does not know which it is yet." Ruby looked at the letter in her hand, then she looked at Arthur. "This is not how a person makes decisions," she said. "Being trapped into something, having choices taken away, I need to be clear about that." "You are right," Arthur said, "and I am sorry they should not have done it." "They did it because they love me," Ruby said. It came out more quietly than she intended. "Yes," Arthur said. "And because they are worried about you," she said. He did not answer that. Ruby set the letter down on the table. She looked at the flour on her skirt and the sugar jar and the familiar worn pine surface of the kitchen table that she had scrubbed about a dozen times by now. "I need a new train voucher," she said. "I will get you one," Arthur said immediately. "Today if you want. I will ride to town today and have it for you by evening." She looked at him. "Or," he said, and his voice was lower now, and the word landed in the kitchen with a weight that she felt in her sternum. "You tell me what it would take for you to stay. Not as a housekeeper, as something else entirely. And I ask you properly, not through the machinations of my children who have apparently decided to take matters into their own hands." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside she could hear the windmill turning and a horse somewhere in the paddock and the distant sound of Nora singing something to herself upstairs. That unconscious happy humming that Arthur had told her about, the one that had belonged to Alina and now belonged to Nora, and that Ruby had been hearing for weeks. "Ask me then," Ruby said. Arthur crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and stopped directly in front of her. He was close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to look at him fully. His dark eyes were very serious and very open, and she could see plainly that this cost him something, that a man this guarded did not do this easily, that he was standing here without his armor because he had decided she was worth more than his protection. "Ruby Ramsey," he said, "I have been trying to talk myself out of this since approximately the 3rd day you were here, and I have made a complete failure of it. I am asking you to stay. Not for 2 weeks and not for a month. I am asking you to consider staying permanently, in whatever way that makes sense to you, and I am asking you to give me the chance to make it worth your while." She looked at him. "Are you asking me to be your housekeeper permanently?" she said. "No," he said. "I am asking you to be my wife, if you would consider it. I understand if you would not." The word wife settled over Ruby like something heavy and warm and terrifying. She thought about Kansas and all the places after Kansas. She thought about sleeping in a dozen different rooms and eating at a dozen different tables and never once feeling as though any of it was hers. She thought about the kitchen garden and Thomas's rock collection and Nora's drawings. She thought about the ride to the north pasture and the cottonwood leaves and the stirrups nearly touching and the look they had held on the creek bank. She thought about his laugh, which she had heard only once, that short genuine sound that had done unauthorized things to her chest and had been doing them ever since. "You do not know me well enough to ask that," she said. "I know you better than I have known anyone since Alina," he said steadily. "I know how you take your coffee and what you reach for when you are thinking, and that you have read that botanical encyclopedia cover to cover twice since you arrived, and that you cry only when you think no one is watching, and that you reorganized my kitchen based on where my hand went when I was not paying attention. I know that you faced down my 9-year-old son's intellectual ambushes without flinching, and that you sat with my 7-year-old daughter at 5 in the morning when she dreamed about her mother and could not go back to sleep." Ruby stopped breathing for a moment. "Nora told you about that," she said. "Nora tells me everything eventually," Arthur said. "She told me you sat with her for an hour and did not say anything patronizing, and that you showed her the names of 3 different star constellations through the bedroom window until she was calm enough to sleep." The tears that had dried on her cheeks made her face feel tight. "I am not a gentle person," Ruby said. "You should know that. I am practical and impatient, and I have very strong opinions about things that are none of my business. I will argue with you." "Good," Arthur said. "I need someone who will argue with me." "I will not be a housekeeper who happens to live here," she said. "If I stay as an equal in every way." "I would not have it any other way," he said, and she could tell he meant it. She looked at him for a long moment. "The children," she said, "will be insufferably pleased with themselves," Arthur said, and there was the laugh again, that short genuine sound, this time not hidden at all. "They will take complete credit for the whole thing." "They deserve some credit," Ruby said. "It was a decent plan, even if the execution was ethically questionable." "We will have a very firm conversation about the ethics," Arthur said. "After," Ruby said. "After what?" he said. She looked at him. "After you finish asking me properly." Something shifted in his expression. He reached out and took her hand, the one that was not still holding the children's letter, and held it carefully. His hands were large and calloused and warm, and he held hers the way you hold something you are not sure you are permitted to hold but are going to hold anyway. "Ruby Ramsey," he said, "will you marry me?" She did not say yes immediately. She stood there for another moment, just holding his look and feeling all of the complicated, terrifying, enormous things that were moving through her. The grief for her own losses and the fear of new ones and the long aching want for something that stayed, for somewhere that was hers, for people that were hers. "Yes," she said. The smile that crossed Arthur Underwood's face was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen from a guarded man, and it made her feel something so large and warm and real that she almost could not contain it. He was still holding her hand. He raised it and pressed his lips to the back of it, old-fashioned and deliberate, and she felt the warmth of it run all the way up her arm. "We should tell the children," Ruby said. "They are probably listening at the door," Arthur said. The kitchen door burst open. Thomas and Nora came through it with the contained velocity of a small explosion. Nora went directly to Ruby and wrapped her arms around her middle with a grip that Ruby had not expected from a 7-year-old, fierce and complete, and Ruby put her arms around her and held on. Thomas stopped in front of his father with his hands in his pockets, looking simultaneously proud of himself and prepared to receive a consequence. "I know we are going to have the conversation about the ethics," Thomas said. "We are absolutely going to have the conversation about the ethics," Arthur confirmed. "But," Thomas said, "it worked." Arthur looked down at his son, and there was that expression on his face, the complicated, open expression that Ruby had seen when he listened to Nora humming, and he put his hand on Thomas's shoulder. "It worked," Arthur confirmed. "But we are still having the conversation." Thomas nodded philosophically. He looked at Ruby over his father's arm, and his expression was so plainly, nakedly hopeful that she had to look away for a moment to collect herself. "You are staying," Thomas said. "I am staying," Ruby said. The sound Thomas made was not a word. It was simply the sound of a 9-year-old who has been holding his breath for longer than he knew. The wedding was held in December, which was practical because it gave Ruby time, and because December in that part of Texas was cold enough to require good coats, but not so brutal as to make an outdoor ceremony impossible. They were married by the Reverend Caleb Morris in the church with the white steeple that needed painting, on a Saturday morning with frost on the grass, and the sky so blue and clear and enormous that it looked like something painted by someone who had never learned moderation. Mrs. Patton cried from the second pew and made no apology for it. Pete and Domingo came in from the ranch in clean shirts they had clearly borrowed from each other and sat in the back. Several families from the surrounding ranches attended, because Halo Creek was the kind of community that showed up for things, and because Arthur Underwood, having found someone after 3 years of visible grief, was the kind of event that people felt was worth marking. Nora was the flower girl, and carried a basket of dried wildflowers with the gravity of someone performing a sacred function. Thomas stood beside his father and handed over the ring at the correct moment with such carefully performed casualness that Ruby almost laughed out loud. The ring was a narrow gold band that had belonged to Arthur's maternal grandmother, and it fit Ruby's finger as though it had been waiting for it. The Reverend said the words, and they said their words, and when Arthur kissed her, Ruby heard someone in the congregation exhale as though they had been holding their breath. They walked out of the church into the December sunlight, and Nora immediately took Ruby's free hand in hers, and Thomas on Arthur's other side said, "Papa, did you know that in some cultures the winter solstice wedding is considered the most auspicious kind?" And Arthur said Thomas, and Thomas said what? And Ruby started laughing, genuinely and freely, in the cold morning air. They went back to the ranch for a dinner that Mrs. Patton had organized with the help of 2 other women from town. Long tables set up in the parlor and the entrance hall because the house was full of people. And there was roast beef and sweet potato pie and cornbread, and a cake that Nora had helped ice with more enthusiasm than precision. By evening, when the guests had gone and Mrs. Patton had cleared the last of it and taken her cheerful leave, and Pete and Domingo had gone back to the bunkhouse, and the children were finally, inevitably asleep, the house was quiet in a way that felt different from any of the quiet Ruby had known there before. Arthur found her in the kitchen, as he always seemed to find her in the kitchen, but she was not working. She was simply standing at the window, looking out at the dark yard and the barn and the windmill and the enormous black sky thick with stars. He came and stood beside her. "All right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. And then, more honestly, "It is a lot." "It is," he said. "You do not have to have all the feelings at once." "That is a very compassionate thing to say for someone who is allegedly not a gentle person," she said, smiling at her own reflection in the dark window. "I never said I was not a gentle person," he said. "That is what you said about yourself." She turned to look at him. He was close as he had been in the kitchen when he asked her, and his expression was warm and steady and entirely real. "Arthur," she said, "thank you." "For what?" he said. "For asking," she said. "For asking me as an equal, for meaning it." He reached up and tucked a piece of her dark hair that had come loose behind her ear, the gesture careful and new and entirely his. "I meant every word of it," he said. She leaned forward and kissed him, which she had not done yet, not the way she meant to. and his arms came around her in the warm kitchen with the stars enormous outside the window and the windmill turning in the cold December wind. And it was nothing like anything she had been waiting for because she had not been waiting for it. But it was completely, entirely, perfectly right. Winter settled over the ranch with a hard beauty. Ruby learned the rhythms of the land in its cold season, the way the cattle needed managing through the freezes, the way the well pump required careful maintenance to keep from sticking, the way the house itself responded to the temperature changes with small expansions and contractions of its old wood that created a nighttime language of creaks and settling that she came to know like a vocabulary. She was not bored. She had never been bored in her life, and she was not about to start now. She was building something, and the building of it was absorbing in a way that was completely different from any of the jobs she had done before. This was not someone else's house to manage. This was her house, her kitchen garden under its winter mulch, her accounts ledger, her children's education, which she had taken over from the Halo Creek School entirely at Thomas's insistence, because the school in town had run out of things to teach him, and the teacher had admitted as much with a mixture of relief and resignation. She taught Thomas mathematics and natural science and Latin, which she had taught herself from books, and which he devoured with the specific joy of someone who had been waiting for something suitably difficult. She taught Nora to read music, because there was an old upright piano in the parlor that had belonged to Alina, and that no one had touched in 3 years, and Nora had been circling it with suppressed longing since Ruby arrived. The first time Nora played a complete, simple piece all the way through without stopping, she looked up from the keys with an expression so purely and completely happy that Ruby had to leave the room for 60 seconds under the pretense of needing something from the kitchen. She stood in the kitchen and put both hands flat on the cool table surface and breathed. This was hers, all of it. She had not expected it. She had not been looking for it. She had answered an advertisement for a 2-week position and somehow arrived at the center of something that felt more like home than any place she had ever been. Arthur found her there, standing at the table with her hands flat, 60 seconds after Nora's music had started again, sweet and careful and slightly imprecise from the parlor. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am wonderful," she said. "I am embarrassingly, ridiculously wonderful." He smiled at her, that unguarded smile that she still felt in her chest every single time. He came and put his arms around her from behind and leaned his chin on her shoulder, and they listened to their daughter play the piano together in the winter kitchen. In February, Ruby told him she thought she might be pregnant. She said it the way she said most things, directly and without preamble, while she was doing the accounts. She looked up from the ledger and said, "I think we are going to have a baby." Arthur went very still. Then he sat down heavily in the chair across from her, which she had never seen him do. He was not a person who sat down heavily in chairs. "Ruby," he said. "It is early yet," she said, "but I am fairly certain." He looked at her across the kitchen table. His dark eyes were doing the complicated, rapid cycling of a person feeling several enormous things at once. "Are you all right?" he asked, and the quality of his voice was different now, low and careful and very present. "Yes," she said. "Arthur, I am fine. People have been doing this since the beginning of time." "Alina," he started and then stopped. "Was not me," Ruby said, gently but clearly. "I am not fragile, and the nearest doctor is 3 miles away. And Mrs. Patton has helped at more births in this county than most professional midwives. We are going to be fine." He stood up and came around the table and held her face in his 2 hands and looked at her with an expression that was so undefended she had to put her hands over his. "I love you," he said. It was the first time he had said it as simply and directly as that, without anything around it. Just those 3 words. She felt them go all the way down to the floor of her. "I love you," she said back. He kissed her forehead and both of her cheeks and then her mouth, and she laughed against his lips because she was happy, genuinely and fully happy, which was not something she had very much experience with and which turned out to be even better than she had imagined when she had imagined it from a distance. They told the children at dinner. Thomas received the information with immediate scientific interest. "What will it be?" he demanded. "There is no way to know yet," Ruby told him. "The odds are approximately equal." Thomas considered this unsatisfying but intellectually acceptable. Nora said nothing for a long moment. Then she looked at Ruby with those gray-green eyes and said, "Will it be mine too?" Ruby reached across the table and took Nora's hand. "Yes," she said, "it will absolutely be yours too." Nora squeezed her hand once hard and then released it and picked up her fork. In June, Ruby gave birth to a boy. The labor was long but not complicated, attended by Mrs. Patton and the doctor from town, a calm, capable man named Dr. Henderson, who had been practicing medicine in Halo Creek for 15 years and who had dealt with considerably more difficult situations than this one. Arthur spent most of the labor in the hallway outside the bedroom door, which Mrs. Patton had firmly closed in his face, and Thomas and Nora spent it in the kitchen at the kitchen table, Thomas not reading a book and Nora not eating the bread Ruby had baked that morning. When Mrs. Patton opened the bedroom door and told Arthur he could come in, he went so fast he nearly knocked the doorframe sideways. Ruby was propped up on pillows with the baby on her chest, tired and bright-eyed and entirely herself. The baby was dark-haired and very small, and was making the specific sounds of a person who had only just arrived, and was still deciding what to make of things. Arthur sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his son, and Ruby watched him fall in love with both things simultaneously, which was something she would remember her entire life. Thomas and Nora were admitted after a suitable interval. Thomas examined the baby with the focused scientific attention he brought to all interesting phenomena. Nora sat beside Ruby and looked at the baby for a long time with the still, watching quality that was entirely her own. "He is very small," Nora said. "He will get bigger," Ruby said. "What is his name?" Thomas asked. Ruby and Arthur looked at each other. "We thought Henry," Arthur said. "After my mother's father, who was a considerably better man than most of the Underwoods." "Henry," Nora said, trying the name. She looked at the baby. "Hello, Henry." Henry opened his eyes briefly, dark and unfocused, and made a sound that was probably not intentional but that Nora immediately interpreted as a response. "He knows his name already," she announced. Thomas looked dubious but chose not to argue this particular point. The summer was full and warm and busy in the way that ranch summers always are, and Ruby moved through it with Henry on her back in a cloth carrier that Mrs. Patton had shown her to make, doing the work of the house and the kitchen garden and the children's lessons with the same practical competence she brought to everything, but with an interior quality that was entirely new. She had stopped feeling like someone who was temporarily located somewhere. She had stopped feeling like a person in transit. She was home. Randall Cutter appeared one last time in August, riding up the lane in the late afternoon heat. Ruby saw him from the kitchen window, an older man, weathered and hard-faced, with something in his posture that looked different from the aggressive circling of before. He stopped at the gate and did not come through. Arthur went out to meet him. Ruby watched from the window, Henry asleep in his carrier at her back, Nora beside her watching with the same still attention. The conversation was too far away to hear. It lasted several minutes. At the end of it, Cutter reached out and Arthur took his hand briefly. Then Cutter turned his horse around and rode back the way he had come. Arthur came back inside and stood in the kitchen. "What happened?" Ruby asked. "He came to say it was done," Arthur said. "The 40 acres. He wanted to tell me himself that he was letting go of the rest of it." He paused. "He said he has a son in Kansas City who has been asking him to come. He said he is going." "Is he?" Ruby said. "I think so," Arthur said. "He looked like a man who is tired of carrying something." Ruby thought about that, about what it took to put down a grievance that had defined you for 20 years, about the particular courage of deciding you were more than your wound. "That is good," she said. "For him." "Yes," Arthur said. He stood there for a moment in the kitchen with the late afternoon light coming through the window, and then he looked at her and his expression was the steady open one, the one without armor, the one she had learned to love more than she had known she was capable of loving anything. "How is Henry?" he asked. "Asleep," Ruby said. "Entirely peaceful." "Like his mother," Arthur said, and Ruby raised an eyebrow. "I am not peaceful," she said. "I am decisive. There is a difference." He was laughing, that genuine, unguarded laugh, as he crossed the kitchen and kissed her in the afternoon light. October came around again, and with it the particular smell of the air that Ruby had loved since childhood, dry and clear and honest. She stood on the front porch in the early morning with her coffee, which she took with a generous amount of sugar now that she had unfettered access to it, and looked out at the land. The pasture in the early light was golden and enormous, the cattle visible as dark shapes near the creek, the cottonwoods along the water bright yellow. The windmill was turning slowly. Behind her the house was full of sounds. Henry in his basket in the parlor, making the small conversational sounds of a baby who had been awake for half an hour and was managing the situation. Thomas in his room, almost certainly reading something, and definitely not doing his assigned Latin conjugations yet. Nora at the piano, the careful notes of the morning practice floating through the open window, and Arthur's footsteps, unhurried, coming through the entrance hall. He came out onto the porch and stood beside her. He had brought his own coffee, and he looked out at the same view she was looking at, and the two of them stood together in the early morning quiet, shoulder to shoulder, not needing to say anything at all. A year ago she had been in Denver with $6.42 and a carpet bag. She had answered an advertisement for a 2-week position. She had arrived here with every intention of leaving before the leaves turned. And then 2 stubborn, clever, loving children had stolen her train ticket and hidden her in a life she had not known she was looking for, and she had been furious for approximately 20 minutes before she understood that they had seen something she had been too guarded to see herself. "What are you thinking?" Arthur asked. She looked at the golden morning light on the Texas grass and felt Henry's small, warm weight through the parlor window in her peripheral awareness, and heard Nora's careful music, and thought about Thomas's incandescent mind, and the kitchen with the coffee things exactly where they should be, and the kitchen garden that was hers, and the gold ring on her finger that fit as though it had been waiting. "I am thinking," she said, "that Thomas and Nora are going to be insufferably pleased with themselves for the rest of their lives." Arthur laughed. "They have earned it," he said. Ruby leaned into him, her shoulder against his arm, and he put his arm around her without needing to think about it, easy and complete and permanent. "They really have," she agreed. The windmill turned in the morning breeze, and the cattle moved slowly through the golden grass, and inside the house Henry made a sound that moved rapidly from conversational to requiring attention, and Nora's music paused, and Thomas's voice carried down the stairs saying, "I will get him," in the tone of an older brother who had been practicing competence, and Arthur's arm tightened briefly around Ruby's shoulders before they both turned to go back inside, into their house, their morning, their life. The one that had been built from 2 weeks that became a month that became forever. The one that 2 children had decided, firmly and without apology, was worth keeping. Ruby Ramsey walked back through the front door of her home with the October air in her lungs and her husband's hand finding hers in the entrance hall, and she thought that if she had known, back in Denver with her carpet bag and her $6 and her very reasonable 2-week plan, she might have been too frightened to come. And she was grateful with everything she had that she had not known, that she had simply come, that they had simply refused to let her leave. By the following spring, the kitchen garden was the finest in the county, and Mrs. Patton told everyone who would listen that it was entirely Ruby's doing. Thomas was 11, and had begun corresponding by mail with a natural historian in Austin who had heard of him through some roundabout academic connection, and who sent him specimens and papers that Thomas received with the focused reverence of a person receiving sacred texts. Nora could play 4 complete pieces on the piano and had begun composing small, tentative things of her own that she played only when she thought no one was listening, but that Ruby always heard from the kitchen, and that Arthur always heard from wherever he was in the house. and that they had learned to receive silently, and with the particular quality of attention that did not interrupt. Henry was 10 months old and had Arthur's dark eyes, and what appeared to be Ruby's absolute refusal to be deterred. He was pulling himself up on things and regarding the problem of walking with the expression of someone who has identified the core issue and is working methodically toward a solution. On an evening in late March, Ruby was sitting on the front porch watching Henry make determined attempts at the porch steps from below, Arthur beside her, when Thomas came out of the house with a piece of paper in his hand and the specific purposeful stride of someone delivering important information. "I have been calculating," Thomas announced, stopping in front of them. "Of course you have," Arthur said. "I have been calculating that if Ruby had not stayed, the house management alone would have cost Papa approximately twice what he paid her, because no one else would have been as efficient. And additionally, Henry would not exist and Nora would not play the piano and Papa would not whistle. So the net value to this household of Ruby staying is effectively incalculable." Ruby looked at Thomas. "Are you justifying retroactively the theft of my train ticket?" Thomas met her eyes with the calm of someone who has done the math and is confident in it. "I am presenting a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis," he said. "You are not wrong," Ruby said. "But you are also still not off the hook for the ethics." "I know," Thomas said, entirely untroubled. He folded his paper with satisfaction and went back inside. Arthur was doing his best not to laugh. He was not succeeding. "Your son," Ruby said. "Our son," Arthur corrected. She looked at him. The March evening was cool and the stars were beginning to appear in the enormous Texas sky, and Henry had made it to the second porch step and was looking extremely pleased with himself. "Our son," Ruby agreed. Arthur took her hand. Below them, Henry completed his conquest of the porch steps and sat down at the top of them with the expression of a general who has won an important engagement and is considering the next campaign. Inside, Nora's music started again. One of her own small compositions, quiet and tentative and entirely hers. The windmill turned. The stars came out over the Texas plain, one by one and then all at once, filling that enormous sky from edge to edge with more light than you could count if you tried from now until morning. Ruby Ramsey, who had been so certain she was only passing through, leaned her head against her husband's shoulder and breathed. She was not passing through. She had arrived. She was exactly, completely, permanently home.